Electric motor companies are constantly telling 3 big lies. In this video, we're going to learn a simple trick that'll help us prove whether their performance numbers are real or fake. Hey everybody, AJ here, and welcome back to the Eagle Ray channel where we do all things DIY electric boats. Marine motors, batteries, solar panels, you name it. If it's got volts and it's on a boat, you are in the right place. Today, we are going to uncover the lies. If you're one of those people who enjoys the Eagle Ray channel, you're probably going to be in the market for a new boat motor sometime in the next few years. It might be just a trolling motor, or you might be looking at one of these fancy new electric outboards. But anytime you're in the market, you're going to get on Amazon, you'll see a whole list of options, and the problem is essentially all of them are going to show you numbers that are very misleading on purpose. They'll show you pounds of thrust, they'll show you horsepower equivalent, they'll show you a bunch of flashy data that's designed to distract you from the fact that their motor is quite a bit wimpier than it seems. I am the furthest thing from an electric vehicle hater. I have a whole channel about electric DIY. I love working with these motors. What I don't love though is shady business practices, and the industry is rife with dishonesty right now, and I kind of get it. It's an emerging market where demand is really low, and so the prices as a result have to be really high. Under those conditions, I think it's really enticing for any electric motor company to try and fudge their performance numbers a little bit. So how would you ever get a fair look at what you'll actually get for the price? We need a frame of reference for comparison. We need a way to measure motor performance that's reliably the same across all motors so that we can accurately assess the value of each of them relative to the whole market. Last week on the Eagle Ray channel, we figured out a trick for pricing batteries in an apples-to-apples way, and we're about to do the same thing for motors. What we did was identify the most important factor that creates value in the product. It has to be something easy to measure across all competitors. So for batteries, we chose energy, and for motors, we're going to choose power. And they're pretty much the same idea across the board, except if you notice the kWh versus the kW are almost the same, except the batteries have the H on the end, which stands for hours. The reason we do that is because batteries need to be tracked over a certain amount of time, and that's a big part of their value. How much time do they last before they go dead and need a recharge? You have to keep track of that, and that's why we multiply the hours in. Whereas with motors, we're not so much concerned about how long it's going to last. If we just leave it on and it's in good condition, it's just going to keep going and going. So when we're trying to figure out the value, we really just pay attention to the momentary power. How many kilowatts is it going to pull if I full throttle it right now? And once we have that power number, we just need to do a little math to figure out how much that company is charging us per each of those units of power. Because power is power, it should cost about the same for every competitor in a fair market. But we know that this market is far from fair. We saw last week how much some battery companies are trying to overcharge us, and you can bet that certain motor companies are playing similarly sneaky games. So in our quest to find the perfect apples-to-apples measurement, we have to be careful not to get distracted by the slew of potential attributes to choose from. Trolling motors, for example, are constantly measured in pounds of thrust. Outboard motors, usually horsepower equivalent, which is a very sneaky way to measure performance, by the way. More on that later. There's also top speed, acceleration, RPMs. Oh my! There's so many options to choose from, it'll make your head spin. So which one of these is the perfect one? The perfect unit we're looking for is a little line item they always tuck away into their data sheet, hidden among the fine print. It's called input power. Input power is the number of kilowatts your motor pulls out of the battery at full throttle. Generally, motors from different brands that have the same input power should give roughly the same performance on the water, barring other factors. I know there's going to be a handful of you in the comments who are going to say things like, well, what about the propeller pitch and diameter? What about the type of hull? What about the kV value of the motor? I get it. Fellow nerds, I hear you. I too am a card-carrying nerd. I totally get that there's a slew of factors that we could be looking at. We could look at all of them. But the thing is, if we want to boil down to the essence of this, the motor brand can control only certain things. And among those factors, they can control the input power as a primary factor. And also, we have an easy way to measure that factor. And it happens to correlate well with a holistic value of their product. All you need to measure input power is a clamp meter that can handle DC current. You can figure out the power just by putting a clamp meter on the red wire of your battery while the motor is running. That'll give you the amps, multiply that by the voltage, divide the whole thing by 1,000, and you've got your kilowatt number. You have to be careful with these clamp meters though. Don't make the same mistake I did. I picked this one up at Home Depot, and that was a big mistake because Home Depot has things for your home. All the voltage in your home is AC, and so if you get a clamp meter to measure the amps in your home, it's also going to be AC only. This thing does not work on batteries, so I had to get another version of the Klein, which is the Klein CL800, and that one works for DC on batteries. You can find this one in a link in the description. So before we start comparing motors on input power, let's reveal the first lie that these companies often tell us. If we're smart enough to check the data sheet and we are looking at the input power line item, we might feel like we solved the case already, but they have just begun their sneaky tricks. The first lie that they often tell is to pretend that peak power is continuous power. And they'll be very vague about it on purpose a lot of the time. They won't even say peak or continuous. They'll leave it very generic. They'll say input power or something even more generic than that, like power rating. There are two very different types of power: peak power and continuous power. Peak power is that surge of watts that hits the motor right as it jumps from 0 to full throttle. And then as it settles into a momentum state, it uses a lot fewer watts after that. It's a lot like a car drag racing from 0 to 60 versus a car that's just maintaining highway speed. Here's how the trick works. The motor brand is going to give you the peak power instead of the continuous power, even though the peak power is only used for the first few seconds. By all rights, they should tell you the continuous power number because that's what you're going to experience for a vast majority of your usage of their product. But that's not what they do a lot of the time, because they want you to think that the peak power is the continuous power. Out of these 12 motor brands, only these 4 gave us very specific peak versus continuous power ratings in the datasheet, whereas the rest of them gave us only generic input power information in the datasheet, or in a few cases it was even worse. Some of them didn't give us any input power information in the datasheet at all, which means in those cases the only thing you have to go off of is the horsepower designation they give you in their marketing blurb. And when they're that generic, you have to bet that they know what they're doing. They know the difference between peak and continuous power. They're not telling you up front because they want you to look at the higher number, the peak number, and falsely assume that that's the continuous power. In other words, you falsely assume that the motor is a little bit more powerful than it actually is. So what should you do if the company refuses to give you a specific continuous rating? What I do is I handicap assuming that they've given me the peak rating. So the peak rating is typically going to be about 30% higher than continuous, sometimes more. So if I assume that they gave me the peak rating and I want the continuous, then I just need to subtract whatever number they gave me by 30%. Over here we've got a Minn Kota Endura, and on the other side we've got an Elco EP50 outboard. Now obviously you wouldn't ever be in the market to buy one of these or the other. It's like a Pinto versus a Ferrari, but that's not the point. The point of this is to drive the point home that power is power is power. No matter the size of the motor, they're all measured in units of power that are the same despite being different sizes. So you can use the power units to figure out whether you're getting a good price for any of them. And so that's what we're going to try. We're going to take the Endura and convert it to an imaginary 1 kilowatt version of itself so that we can have an apples to apples version to compare to the Elco, which we're going to do the same thing with. Here's how it works. 1 kilowatt divide by the 0.3 kilowatts that the real Endura has. That'll give us a proportion of 3.33. And that is how much we need to grow the size of the Endura in order to make it 1 kilowatt of power. So we grow the price as well by multiplying the 109 by 3.33, and that gives us $363 per kilowatt. That's how much the Endura would cost if it had a kilowatt of power. Now we're going to do the same thing to the Elco to get it apples to apples with that. So we take the Elco's $9,000 and we have to figure out how to get its 26.4 kilowatt size. It's huge. We got to get it smaller in order to compare it to the Endura. We want to get it down to 1 kilowatt. So we take 1 kilowatt divided by 26.4 kilowatts. That gives us 0.04. That's the proportion that we need to shrink it. And so we use that to shrink the price as well. So we multiply the $9,000 price by 0.04, and that gives us $360 per kilowatt. Isn't that crazy? These are both practically the same price per kilowatt. And I don't think that Elco did that by accident. I think they know that when you buy a small versus a big motor, you want to get what you pay for. If you buy a small one, you pay a certain price, and then if you buy an even bigger one, that's you supersizing your purchase. So you shouldn't pay more per unit of power. When you go get a bigger motor, you should, if anything, you should pay less. You should pay a bulk discount. But if there's no discount, you should at least pay a price that's fair compared to the smaller motor. And that's exactly how they priced it. So good for you, Elco. That is fair pricing in my opinion. This apples to apples trick works on just about anything. We used it to compare batteries in last week's video. It works great on motors too, whether they're small or big. You can compare a trolling motor to an electric outboard, and you should never let anybody tell you that you can't do that, because trolling motors and electric outboards both work on the exact same value principle. Higher input power should mean bigger price. Lower input power should mean lower price. And that brings us to the second big lie that these motor companies will often tell you. They want to sell you a trolling motor. Separately, they want to sell you an electric outboard. And that's probably fine as long as you're looking for a small troller and a big outboard. But what if they try and flip that on you and they still try and sell you the same thing? Here's what happens. You are looking for a big trolling motor and a small electric outboard. And this is the dirty secret they're going to hide from you. On the inside, both of these motors are nearly identical because they overlap in input power. So in all the ways that matter on the inside of that motor, they're essentially the same product. And yet, just because one of them says outboard on it, they're going to charge double or triple for that one. They'll charge whatever they think they can get away with. And you're the customer sitting there thinking, you know, it says outboard on it. That makes me feel pretty warm and fuzzy. I think I will pay double for that. That's not a problem at all. To be fair, there are differences between trolling motors and electric outboards. The biggest one is the type of propeller. The prop on a trolling motor is designed to be weak on purpose because it's supposed to optimize for efficiency rather than top speed, whereas in an outboard, it's kind of the opposite. However, if you took both of these categories and you made sure that the input power matches up for the most part, then you could swap the propellers without any problems whatsoever. If you took any of these 3-horse electric outboards and you put a trolling motor prop on it, it would become a trolling motor. That's the thing. These categories are different in name only. They're basically the same on the inside in all ways that matter. A lot of people in the forums have said, well, but the windings are totally different between the two. And yes, they are, but in this range of 1 to 2 kilowatts, that doesn't matter at all because the windings make a rounding error in the amount of overall performance difference. So the factors that you should really look at are the input power and the propeller type. And because the propeller type is swappable, the only one we care about when determining the price is the input power. Let's try another example. We've got the Bigby K1 versus the MotorGuide Xi3. Now I know that the MotorGuide Xi3 has a whole bunch of features that the Bigby doesn't have, but we're just going to focus on input power for right now. And with that in mind, we're going to do the base model of the Xi3 that has no GPS, because we're going to get rid of as many bells and whistles as possible. So the question here is, if you're in the market to power your kayak, are you going to spend $700 for a K1, or are you going to spend $750 for a base model Xi3? To figure that out, we've got to go apples to apples again. So all we do is we take a ratio to convert these to 1 kilowatt each. 1 kilowatt divided by the 0.4 kilowatts that the regular Bixby has in order to imagine a bigger version. And when we do that, we get a ratio of 2.5. Multiply that by the price, and we get a per kilowatt price of $17.50. Before we even get to the MotorGuide, that's a crazy price to charge for the amount of power you get. That's more than 4 times what the other motors we looked at so far are charging. And Bixby is kind of known to be a little bit pricey, but when you really look at it, they're egregiously expensive in my opinion, and that's the proof. So let's look at the MotorGuide and see if it's any better. So we have the same kind of ratio, 1 divided by the 0.6 kilowatts that the MotorGuide has. That gives us a ratio of 1.6, and then we multiply that by the price of $750, and that gives us a total price per kilowatt of $12.50. $350. So the MotorGuide obviously is a much better deal than the Bixby K1, assuming that it has extra features anyway. Even if it didn't, it would still be a better deal just based on the amount of power you get compared to the Bixby K1. However, that's not a good price either for the amount of power you get, in my opinion. I'm not saying the Xi3 isn't a good motor. It's a really cool motor with a lot of good features. But for the amount of power you get out of it, you're paying an arm and a leg. And of course, this video wouldn't be complete if we didn't reveal the third and final lie that motor brands often tell: the dreaded horsepower equivalent rating. If you ever hear one of these brands use the words horsepower equivalent, just run. Run away, because it's a tactic they use that should be considered false advertising, in my opinion. It should be illegal. What they do is they take their electric motor and they give you a number that compares it to what they consider a very similar gas motor, when in actuality, that electric has nowhere near the amount of performance that the gas motor does. And here's how they get away with it. We all know that electric motors are peppy off the line. They have a lot more high-end torque right at the beginning of their throttle curve compared to gas motors. And so manufacturers are using that right now to fool you into thinking a small electric motor is actually bigger than it is. So when they say 3-horse electric versus 3-horse gas, if you drag raced both of those at the same time, you'd find the electric wins for the first few seconds, and then it very quickly falls behind. And why? Because it's not actually a 3-horse. It's nowhere close when it comes down to it. And we're going to prove that in a second. But I want you to keep in mind, I am not an electric hater. I love electric motors. I just find it very frustrating that this particular crop of electric outboards that are on the market today are all exaggerating their specs in a pretty egregious way. And here's the secret weapon you can use to uncover this lie. The horsepower equivalent number can never match up with the actual input power number. So what you want to do is go into the datasheet, get the actual input power number, and you can easily convert that to actual horsepower. All you have to do is multiply it by 1.34, and there's your real horsepower. And the funny thing is, that number never matches up with the horsepower equivalent number. The horsepower equivalent number is always blown up by 2 or 3 times as much as it should be. Even though pretty much every electric motor brand uses this trick, I'm going to pick on ePropulsion a little bit, because on the hero card of this product page, they do it in such an egregious way it blows my mind. Look at this. We've got 3 horsepower right next to 1 kilowatt. Those two pieces of information are not the same. They're not even close to each other. And you can prove it with that simple math. You take the kilowatt number times 1.34, that converts it into horsepower. 1 times 1.34 is 1.34. This is a 1.34 horse motor. It's not a 3-horse, it's a 1.34 horse. They've exaggerated the horsepower by almost 3x. Horsepower is just the wrong measurement to be looking at in general. You should forget about pounds of thrust also. It's all about input power. Input power is our apples to apples metric across every single electric motor. So if you're looking at a product page and they don't display the input power prominently, they should get some grief for that, because it behooves companies to give us the information that we need in order to make an informed purchase about their product. If you like this video, hit that like button, because obviously I am not sponsored by any of these motor brands. And by the way, we just reached 1,000 subscribers, and so I'm soon going to be opening memberships for Eagle Ray audience members who want to donate a few bucks a month to allow content like this to flourish. Unbiased, unsponsored content is hard to keep going without advertisers, and it takes your help to make it happen. So I really appreciate anybody who's interested, and there will be a lot of perks for channel members. And also, we're still doing the Milwaukee angle grinder giveaway. You don't have to be a channel member for that. You just have to be a subscriber. And that's happening this Sunday, 2 p.m. on the live stream, if we can get 100 people in the chat. So this is a $200-ish value. So if you want to win this, make sure you show up in the live stream this Sunday. Next week, we are doing rocker switches. We're having a video coming out next Wednesday about these switches. They're the most popular switches that anybody uses on kayaks and boats. But the thing is, there are a lot of misconceptions about these. They have a whole bunch of functionality built in that almost nobody ever uses. So next week's video is going to show you all the things you never knew about these switches. It's going to be pretty cool. If you want to see that, make sure that you are subscribed. Hit that bell notification so that you get a notice when that video comes out. And until I see you in the live stream on Sunday, I hope that you set aside some time this week to get out there on the water and have some fun. Until then, boat safe, take care.